CVP analysis allows us to understand how much money we need to sell, or the sales volume that we need to have in order to break even, or even make a desired amount of profit. As restaurants or hospitality firms, it's our job to make money. So it's important to know the point in sales where we're actually doing that and we're not losing money. And again, we can do this on the dollar sales volume or the number of units required to break even based on our projected variable costs and fixed costs. In order to complete a cost volume profit analysis, we have to make a few assumptions about the business, or about our costs for that matter. All costs can either be fixed or variable. Okay, so we have to understand which costs fall under which cost category. We also have to understand that all variable costs are directly variable, so increase or decrease directly based on sales, and that all fixed costs are stable. We also assume that sales prices are constant and the sales mix will not change for the purpose of our analysis. So for every analysis that we do in CVP, it represents a fixed scenario. So our cost per unit will not change, although they will go up and down with sales volume. Our fixed costs will not change whatsoever, and neither will our prices or our sales mix. Here I'd like to introduce to you the cost volume profit equation, and that is that sales equals your sales cost plus your labor cost plus your overhead plus your profit. Okay, we can restate this to be a little bit more simple to our sales. So I'm just going to bring up the pen here. There we go. Our sales equals our variable costs plus our fixed costs and plus our profit. Now this equation can be rearranged another 3 ways. To be our variable costs equal our sales minus our fixed costs minus our profit. Oops. And another way to isolate for our fixed cost, because this is again a constant scenario in that once we know the sales, our variable cost, our fixed cost, and our profit, they will not change unless we physically change them, but we can rearrange the equation to solve for unknowns if we need to. So in this case, our fixed costs equals our sales minus our variable costs minus our profit, and our profit equals our sales minus our variable costs and our fixed costs. So again, knowing 3 out of the 4 variables, we can isolate for the unknown and solve for it. Sometimes within CVP, we need to forecast some costs because they might not be directly known. For instance, our total variable costs would be our food cost plus our beverage cost plus our variable labor. In order to be able to calculate that, we would have to know all of those things, or we'd have to forecast them. So in order to forecast our variable labor, we would have to take our average hourly rate and multiply it by the number of hours used, or number of hours projected to be used. To calculate our variable food cost, we would take the average cost per portion and then multiply it by the expected amount of portions to be used. And then our variable beverage cost, fairly similar. It's our average cost per portion multiplied by the expected amount of portions to be used. And that way we could forecast or even just understand or know what those different variable costs are for our CVP. We now introduce to you the contribution margin. Contribution margin as an equation is your total sales minus your variable costs. What this represents, or what your contribution margin represents, is the amount of money left over after your variable costs are covered that go towards providing covering your fixed costs and providing for a profit. And we use our contribution margin or different variations of our contribution margin in break-even analysis. So again, total sales minus variable cost equals our contribution margin, or you could even say that your sales price per unit minus your variable cost per unit would equal your contribution margin per unit. as I was saying in the previous slide, we can also calculate our contribution margin per unit, and that's the amount of money left per unit that goes towards covering your fixed costs and providing for a profit. Again, this is our sales price minus our variable costs per unit. This is especially helpful when calculating your break-even points in units. So how many hot dogs do I need to sell today in order to break even? And we use our contribution margin per unit to do that. And now we'll introduce the variable and contribution rates. Our variable rate is our variable costs divided by sales. So essentially, it's your variable cost as a percentage of sales. The contribution rate is our contribution margin divided by sales. So it's kind of our contribution margin as a percentage of sales. If you were to take your variable rate and your contribution rate and add them together, they will always equal 1. That's because our variable rate and our contribution rate are two pieces to a whole. And then using that, if we knew what our contribution rate was and we wanted to know what our variable rate was, we would take 1 minus our contribution rate and it would equal our variable rate, because again, they are two pieces to the whole. Here is an example of us calculating our contribution rate, or our variable costs as a percentage of sales. If our, the equation is our variable costs divided by sales. This will always come out as a percentage in decimal form. And in this case, our variable costs were $141,375, and our sales were $325,000. If we do the math, divide one by the other, we get our variable rate of 0.435, or 43.5%. That's to say that our variable costs in this particular scenario were 43.5% of our sales. In this example, we'll calculate our contribution rate. Now again, there's two ways to calculate your contribution rate. If you know your variable rate, it is 1 minus your variable rate. Let's just get my pen out here. I really got to buy a stylus. It's killing me. So 1 minus our variable rate, if we knew what that was. Or if we know our contribution margin and our sales, it would be our contribution margin divided by sales. In this particular case, because we calculated our variable rate previous to this, we know what it is. So again, 1 minus our variable rate in decimal form equals our contribution rate in decimal form. So our contribution rate was 56.5%, which means that 56.5% of our sales went towards covering our fixed costs and providing us a profit. And now we move on to break-even points, or being able to calculate our break-even point. Again, we can do this in terms of sales volume or in terms of units. Now, if some of you are wondering what break-even means to make zero profit. A break-even point means that you're not making any money, but you're not losing any either. It means you had just enough sales to cover your variable costs and cover your fixed costs, but left profit equaling 0. So 0 profit. Okay, that's a terrible 0. So how to calculate our break-even point in sales dollars? What we do is we take our fixed costs. And divide it by our contribution rate. Okay, more specifically, we divide it by our contribution rate in decimal form, and that will give us the point in sales, so the dollar amount of sales, at which we are not making any money, but we're not losing any either. This point is very important to know, because anything below that sales point, you know that you're losing money. And anything above that sales point is you making money. Okay, because the break-even point, again, profit equals 0. added those zeros. Here we have an example of our break-even point in sales. Again, it's our fixed costs divided by our contribution rate. If our fixed costs were $146,250 and our contribution rate was 56.5%, then our break-even point in sales would be $258,848. Again, we take the fixed cost divided by the contribution rate of 0.565, and this is the amount or the sales volume at which we are covering our fixed costs but making zero profit. Okay. Now, while it's handy or good to know your break-even point in sales, it's also good to know the dollar sales volume that you need to make or sell in order to cover your fixed costs, but also achieve a desired amount of profit. Because we're in business, we are a for-profit business for the most part, especially restaurants. So in order to calculate the sales needed to achieve a certain amount of profit for you, we take our fixed costs, add in the amount of profit to be, sorry, I'm just pulling my pen, the amount of profit we want to make, and then divide it by our contribution margin, contribution rate again. So the only difference between this formula and the formula before, which is our break-even point, so zero profit, is the addition of the amount of profit that you want to make. And finally, we have our break-even point in units. So while it's good to know how much sales you have to have break even, it's also important to know how many units you need to sell in order to break even. Okay, and we do this in a very similar way to the dollar method by taking our fixed costs but we divide it by our contribution margin per unit, which again is our sales price minus our variable costs per unit, and that equals the amount of items or units we need to sell in order to break even. Now, where this becomes a little difficult for food service operations is that we don't have we sell many different items. We sell liquor items, we sell food items, and they all have different contribution margins. So I guess calculating a break-even point in units for a restaurant, you would have to calculate your average contribution margin per unit. That's difficult because beverages have a higher contribution margin per unit, and they have a higher contribution rate. Food has a higher contribution margin per unit when compared to beverage, and if you were to average those two out together, you might have a little bit of a skewed average contribution margin per unit. So you have to understand your sales mix as well, because which would create a bit of a weighted average. That would be a little bit more accurate, and I suppose we can go over that in class because that's definitely relevant here.